Other than his sister June and his cousin Carl, who would later adopt Mary Ellen, Roethke had few friends to play with. Ted spent a great deal of time with his father around the greenhouse. Roethke's biographer, Alan Seeger, describes these early days in The Glass House. By absorption, the long silent stares of a child, by a question now and then or a statement volunteered by his father, Ted learned the yearly seasons of the greenhouse, which flowers were planted from seeds, which from slips, which from bulbs, the various manures and fertilizers in extravagant detail, the flowers' diseases and their cures, the weeds that infested them. Sour clover was one, and the kids liked to eat it. The different periods of growth into maturity, and how fine the timing and the temperature had to be for Easter lilies to bloom at Easter, not a week later. And there were no chemical retardants then. And lastly, the marketing, the making of bouquets and flower pieces, the blending of the colors and textures of the flowers, and all the tissue paper in the boxes. Sometimes Ted rode on the truck with August Fisher, the driver, and scurried up to the door to deliver the flowers himself, full of pride and importance, pushing the doorbell and crying, "Flowers from Roethke's."
Here we are near Ted Roethke's grave. It's in Oakwood Cemetery, and it's a place with which he was familiar. As a child, with his father being a florist, much of their business had to do with cemeteries, the carrying of flowers and the decorating of graves. And many times he was commissioned to do this kind of work. I don't think he was ever afraid of cemeteries. There are several poems of his that bring them up, and here's one, Moss Gathering. To loosen with all 10 fingers held wide and limber, and to lift up a patch, dark green, the kind for lining cemetery baskets. Thick and cushiony like an old-fashioned doormat. The crumbling small hollow sticks on the underside mixed with roots, and wintergreen berries and leaves still stuck to the top. That was moss gathering. But something always went out of me when I dug loose those carpets of green, or plunged to my elbows in the spongy yellowish moss of the marshes. And afterward I always felt mean jogging back over the logging road, as if I'd broken the natural order of things in that swampland, disturbed some rhythm, old and of vast importance, by pulling off flesh from the living planet, as if I had committed against the whole scheme of life a desecration. Ted Roethke was a part of his family and their goals, but always he felt himself a little different, as if some things were being desecrated. He was home a lot in the summers, even after he'd graduated from university and become a professor. And Saginaw was part of his life, and he loved going with the bloods, as he would say, the people of aristocracy. He played tennis with some of them. His best tennis partner was Burroughs Morley, who was entwined in the name of 2 aristocratic families. In fact, Ted even mentions these families in his Saginaw song.
Weed puller. Under the concrete benches, hacking at black hairy roots, those lewd monkey tails hanging from drain holes, digging into the soft rubble underneath, webs and weeds, grubs and snails and sharp sticks, or yanking through fern shapes coiled green and thick, like dripping smilax, tugging all day at perverse life, the indignity of it, with everything blooming above me, lilies, pale pink cyclamen, roses, whole fields lovely and in violet, me down in that feeder of weeds, crawling on all fours, alive in a slippery grave.
The Roethkes maintained a number of florist shops on both the east and west sides of the Saginaw for many years, and they still have a hand in it today.
I'm standing in front of the main entrance where the horses would come out from the Benjamin livery stable. 2 blocks up was the west side branch of the Roethke flower shop, which would service flowers for all occasions. That's what this poem is about. This poem is called On the Road to Woodlawn. I miss the polished brass, the powerful black horses, the drivers creaking the seats of the Baroque hearses, the high-piled floral offerings with sentimental verses, the carriages reeking with varnish and stale perfume. I miss the pallbearers momentously taking their places, the undertakers' obsequious grimaces, the craned necks, the mourners' anonymous faces, and the eyes, still vivid, looking up from a sunken room.
When he wasn't working around the greenhouses, Ted wandered the lands surrounding them. On a BBC broadcast in July 1953, he recalled, "As a child, I had several worlds to live in, which I felt were mine. One place was the Tittabawassee River, which he ran to some days after school. Here he walked along the shore and waded in the shallows. These images, like those of the greenhouse, would occur and reoccur in his poems throughout his life. In a real sense, he never left these places."
My store is located on North Michigan Avenue in Saginaw. And not too far from here, a mile and a half, is where Theodore Roethke grew up. He went to school here in Saginaw. His sister taught school here in Saginaw, as a matter of fact. Many of my customers remember her, some fondly, some not. And just up the street a little bit is Zinger's, which is the old Shook Hotel, where I'm led to believe that Mr. Roethke bent an elbow more than once. So he prowled all over this area, and as this store was a dime store for about 60 or 70 years, he probably wandered in here on occasion. I'd like to read a couple bits of Mr. Roethke's poetry, if I may. The first piece is titled River Incident. A shell arched under my toes, stirred up a whirl of silt that riffled around my knees. Whatever I owed to time slowed in my human form. Seawater stood in my veins. The elements I kept warm crumbled and flowed away. And I knew I had been there before, in that cold granite slime, in the dark, in the rolling water. The minimal. I study the lives on a leaf, the little sleepers, numb-nudgers in cold dimensions, beetles in caves, newts, stone-dead fishes, lice tethered to long, limp, subterranean weeds, squirmers in bogs and bacterial creepers were wriggling through wounds like elvers in ponds, their wan mouths kissing the warm sutures, cleaning and caressing, creeping and healing.
Though never official members, Ted and his sister June Roethke went regularly to the First Presbyterian Church here on the corner of Court and Harrison Streets. According to Seeger's biography, June remembers Ted driving her there in the family car, which means that he continued to go to Sunday school until he was nearly ready to go to college.
These stained glass motifs, heavy with flowers, grain, sowing, and reaping, may have reassured the images that were fermenting in young Ted's fertile mind.
By the time Ted was 14, a significant portion of his imaginative landscape had been laid out. In some respects, he'd had a kind of idyllic childhood, but there was trouble coming.
By 1922, relations between the two owners of the Roethke greenhouses had deteriorated. So much so that, though the exact details are not known, Otto Roethke sold his share of the business to Charles. Otto began to sicken.
In February of 1923, Charles committed suicide.
2 months later, in April, Otto died of cancer.
Ted was sitting in his father's place at the head of the table the next month when he turned 15.